Today, our guest is Amanda Gross, and she has written a new book that she's going to tell us about. And the title, which is what caught my eye, is Get Ready, White Women. And there is nothing that I like better than to introduce new frameworks to look at where we've been, who we are, and where we're going. And I'm fascinated. So, Amanda, what can you tell us about what on earth brought you to be an author on this topic?
Well, thank you for having me. Hello. Um, yeah, I actually didn't really approach writing it as an author or someone who ever aspired to be an author, but I wrote it as an organizer, a community organizer who was encouraged and supported and prompted by community around me to engage with this topic of how does race and gender and class intersect for white women in particular. And what does that mean to show up well in anti-racism work? So it started as a blog. I also didn't think I would write a full-length book. But once I got into writing the blog posts, I realized, oh, I really do need the space to be able to like weave in the historical dimensions and to tell a bigger and more complex story. And once I realized that it was going to be a book, then it kind of took on a life of its own. But
Well, what I love about the intersection of those three things is the holistic approach that it takes. Because when we just try to focus on one, like our platform is advancing racial equity in the US in our lifetime. I was for women over 40. And that's just because of my lived experience in my body. But gender and race and and conditioning are
Mhm.
different depending on class. And all of those are things that tend to divide us instead of make a broader foundation for solidarity.
Mhm. Yeah, I was brought into to some of this work through, like more of a traditional DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion frame, and that way, these different aspects of identity or social location are usually talked about in silos. But then I was also like really brought into feminism actually through womanism and women of color, Black feminism, and intersectionality. And so a lot of my colleagues and friends who are Black women and femmes were really living out right from their own experience and naming this intersectionality. And so for me, it is a way of applying that intersectional lens to my own experience as a status quo. I use the term status quo and passing white woman because I have access to so many spaces. If I don't open my mouth, if folks don't know my politics, right, I can really move through a lot of worlds. But yeah, to just be aware of that, the access that I have because of the body that I'm in, and then how to use that and leverage that with accountability and in order to serve anti-racism.
And to use that privilege and that platform for good. But for good, some people take that to mean for savior. Let me help you. Let me be a do-gooder.
Mhm.
Instead of, the dilemma that I have had in the last couple of years and that still exists between cultures is the idea of an ally who is an ally when it's convenient, when it doesn't cost anything or cost too much. But when it starts to infringe on how people are going to look at me for being an ally, then we'll see them switch gears or fade away. And that's about a 9-to-1 ratio of the women who stay in the work versus the women who fly by when a crisis hits and then move on to the next crisis. Do you see
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, 9 to 1, I hadn't heard that number before, but absolutely, I would say in my organizing, especially the white women's like affinity spaces that I've run, that a lot of folks do leave or leave in different ways, right? Like some folks will like not show up. Some people will check out and not really be fully present and fully in it, even if they're like physically still showing up in the space. And then after maybe that iteration as a group is done, it's interesting to see like who really sticks with it. And I think that can be hard. I mean, it certainly been felt really demoralizing um, over the years to like feel like, oh, we're doing important work with each other and we're building these relationships and I think we're on the same page, and then to experience people opting out for whatever reason, and we all have life stuff going on. I think that's all humans, right? We're all navigating these systems. So that is a big question, is like, how do we really stay with it? And a reason, a big part of the book, and why I wrote White Women Get Ready, is because for me, like, it's not an option to be in this work, because I really understand, not just intellectually, but also like in my body and lived experience, how like our liberation is so interconnected. Like the attack right now on trans folks is directly connected to like what people in power want to make cis women like conform to, right? Like these things are very interconnected, and I think their white saviorism, some of that helping, fixing, and saving can come if we don't understand or really know this to also be our own, like our own liberation and our own healing, which is why I use the healing justice frame. Is so important to root it. And yeah, white women have experienced a lot of oppression, and also that is, we also upheld a lot of harm and oppression of others. And so to really understand the both and how do we hold those multiple roles, both historically and in our lives today. And what needs healing, right? What harm is there? Like I see a lot of white women, especially, I would say like my mom's generation, who are, I think, really, really angry and rageful, and like, rightfully so, and act out of that like own hurt without being able to always hold the multiple roles, right? Which is also this sense of like, if I'm complicit, if I've caused harm, that means I have a lot of agency and power to do something. But there's a lot of fear, especially in the ways that white women are conditioned to, like, not want to be seen as powerful, not wanting to be seen as hurting others. There's like a like, let me not acknowledge that power, or let me deny it. And I think we need to be really clear about what that power is, and step into it, because that's where we have the ability, the capacity to make change happen.
So one of the frameworks that in your summary that you sent me was post-traumatic mistress syndrome,
Mhm.
which brand new. One of the things I love about doing this podcast is I get to meet people I wouldn't meet, and I get to learn things that I didn't know existed. And you framed that after the framework of an author who wrote about, was it slavery or slaveholder syndrome?
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is Dr. Joy DeGruy's work.
Okay.
Yeah, and she's coming out of that healing justice framework as well. She initially published in 2005 this book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so she's looking at the multi-generational inherited trauma for people of African descent,
Yeah.
because of the legacy of enslavement, because of how structural racism continues today. And she says, like in her book, that if there is a post traumatic slave syndrome, then there also must be a post traumatic master syndrome, because to have been complicit, in order to dehumanize others, we dehumanize ourselves. And that's not like the topic of her work. She really is looking at the multi generational inherited trauma for people of African descent. Um, but when I was beginning to really be involved in anti-racist organizing spaces, and especially through the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, their Undoing Racism framework, I was often like holding white affinity spaces and caucuses, and like supporting other white folks and having these conversations about like, how do we move through the world? What are the messages we receive about our value and worth based on our race? How do we internalize those and play it out? And so, yeah, I just like was looking for more support around holding that space and really understanding my own story, and was looking for those resources on post traumatic master syndrome,
All
which
right.
didn't really exist necessarily as like a focused resource. And that's when I was challenged by colleagues to write that book, to engage with that framework. Um, And I really, gender has been such a significant part of my experience. I grew up with a very patriarchal father, um, and influences of like evangelicalism in different ways in the U.S. South. So yeah, I felt like I needed to look at the legacy of the plantation mistress and understand post-traumatic mistress syndrome. Like, what is the multi-generational inherited trauma for white women that we've inherited, whether we have those direct ancestors or not?
Correct.
And
Because
that
it's the
that
culture around us. It's the water we're swimming in.
mhm. Yeah, and what I learned through a lot of my research, especially the historical piece, was that, the way that white womanhood was constructed was really based off of the plantation mistress. So whether we have direct Southern roots or ancestry, with people who enslaved folks, it doesn't really matter, because if you're in a body that's navigating white womanhood, you are being socialized in that history of the like the good plantation wife.
What did that look like then, and how does that translate to us today?
Yeah. I unpack five different white women archetypes. And so two of them are focused on the good plantation wife and then the vixen mistress. And I look at Gone with the Wind as an example, because there are characters in that story that really embody, but the good plantation wife archetype was an elite white woman who ran the plantation household, and there was this like two-sided expectation of her to like enforce order and control in her household. And in order to do that, she used an incredible amount of violence, whether it was emotional, psychological, physical. There's a lot of physical violence that's been documented to control the enslaved folks that were in the house, often a lot of children as well that were around her. But then, so that was like what she did in private in order to maintain this outward facade of being perfect and effortless and graceful and genteel. And so I see that show up a lot in like even my own upbringing, right? And how I learned to like navigate at school. Once I went to school when I was 5 in kindergarten, all of a sudden my at-home personality, which was bossing my little brother around, like being loud, um, like letting people know what my feelings were, like I really adapted within a public school setting to be a good little white girl, because I got, what I needed or what made me feel safe, and was able to really advance and do well in a school setting if I leaned into that. I'm going to like follow the rules and defer to authority and like don't speak until I'm spoken to and know all the answers. So I learned this like, oh, I have a public persona. This is how I present to the rest of the world. And then this is also like what when I came home from school, like immediately, right? I was like throwing my brother against the wall and letting loose because I had
Mhm.
like kept it all together. So for me that showed up as like this kind of almost a split, right, personality and um, navigating different aspects, knowing how to navigate different parts of life in different ways. Specific,
Some
I
of
mean, I think everyone, sorry. Well,
Go
I
ahead.
think everyone has to do that to some extent, but like
Yep.
specifically looking at like how did that show up in white girlhood and show up in
Right.
white
Right. And some of the guests I've had on have talked about code shifting. Um,
codes. Yeah.
the language they use at home is not the language they use in front of white folks ever, because they were cultured very early on with, it's King's English here and it's vernacular here, and don't let the two mix, because there are a lot of biases about what that means about you by the
Hmm.
way you speak.
Hmm. Yeah.
But
And I think this, oh, sorry.
no, I'm good.
Well, I think this can show up too as um, like white women in relationship maybe to colleagues at work. There might be like kind of a forced niceness that we feel like we have to embody or be, but like we're not always being honest about what our real truth is, for whatever the reason. And who we feel like we can show that to is also based on gender and race, right? So like maybe we're not gonna show those parts of ourselves to a white man who is a supervisor or in a position of power. But it feels safer to like let out those parts to the folks of color that maybe we work with, or I think there's like a lot of things to unpack there and how it can show up in the interpersonal dynamics, and like where do we feel like we have to really keep it together and with whom, and where do we feel like we can let loose the kind of like nastier parts of ourselves, right? And there's a way that that has been learned and comes out of the history of the plantation.
So, somewhere between the affinity groups, entry level, let's talk about things that you didn't know existed, to activist, where we're writing and teaching and educating, somewhere along that continuum are basically where I've moved wave two. We've done 100 episodes softening the ground. At episode 101, I'm like, I'm tired of not calling a thing a thing. So now I'm looking for advocacy at minimum, right? If you're ready to move into advocacy, then everything I'm building from here is about empowering, is about you being able to do your internal work, not me having to convince you of the need to do internal work. So if a woman has seen the disruptions and been exposed to all of the conditioning, patriarchal, matriarchal, generational, and had the blowback from people like her or people who look different than her, to be still, to stop doing that because you're making people around you uncomfortable. Don't talk about that in mixed company kind of things. How do they begin to claim their space, their voice, and use that privilege to move the needle forward instead of continue the backslide in silence?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the context, and using, my yoga instructor, Felicia Savage Friedman, would say moment to moment discernment. Because I do think that once you are in a place where you are developing those skills for yourself and you're really beginning to recognize, oh, like stuff is messed up here, like whether it's at school or at work or in your family system. um I know like the tendency can be to like go all in, right? And like if I had been quiet, then I need to like name all the things. And I think developmentally, that's a stage that is important to do, and not to deny, because we need the practice of doing that. But that's not always the most effective or the most skillful approach. So I think it's really important to discern like what is the context, what are the relationships there? Are these folks that like I can really work with, to and that they're going to be open to seeing this perspective, right? Or are these people who are like not there at all? Like I think of it in terms of my family system. Like my dad has gone further and further right, like throughout my lifetime. And I spent years arguing with him, right? Like trying to convince him and make emotional pleas and logical pleas and all the things. And it really at some point I realized like I'm not, this is not effective, it's not helping our relationship, like he's not someone who's going to be able to hear me. But in focusing so much on him, I was neglecting my aunts and my mom and my cousins and all these other folks who like I think heard could learn a lot. Like we're listening in some ways, but like we're also maybe experiencing me in a way that made them uncomfortable. That had I focused on them, which later I figured out those relationships were really important, and that's where my work was. Or another example I often give is like, if it's just me and my dad, maybe I decide, okay, I don't need to like spend my energy arguing with him about something. But if my little cousin is at the dinner table, then it's really important that I step up and provide an alternative example and language and perspective. So for me, it's like, it so depends on the specific context. Um, and I do think like trying to move into being strategic without uh, letting it come from a place of fear, or like compromising yourself, or like, oh, I just don't want to, I'm just opting out. To like move towards a place which is like, okay, I have these choices, and what is most strategic in this moment. And yeah, that really depends on the relationships too.
And how do you react when you encounter criticism for the way you handle it or what you say or where you spend your energy? How do you manage? How do you handle
Mhm.
criticism?
Could you share a little bit more specifically? Like, is
Um,
that? Mhm.
uh, if uh, if you've been in a family gathering and you were direct when it made other people at the table uncomfortable and it wasn't your table,
Mhm.
how do you, after the fact, where when you get, some white women I know think it's called out every time they get challenged on anything.
Mhm.
I always look at it as I'm being called in, particularly if it's a different culture than mine where I don't know what I don't know.
Mhm.
But my reaction is depend on whether I feel called out or called in.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It can kind of depend. It depends also for me where that criticism is coming from. Is it coming from folks who are just uncomfortable with the
Right.
naming, right?
Yeah.
Or is there something there that I mean, I can learn. Usually there's something I can learn. But so I think emotionally, like I feel really uncomfortable still, even though like this is really how I've navigated most of my life. Like it is very vulnerable to put yourself out there. And then afterwards for me, there's like a lot of feelings that come up and I can go in my head and kind of spiral about it. So for me, that's where having like a really grounded self-care practice, knowing what I need. If I'm with family, okay, I'm going to build in that I'm going to take a walk by myself at some point, like just having some of those boundaries and self-care practices. Also to receive critical feedback, like from a person of the global majority, from, one of my Black colleagues, like, then that's like work that I need to do to care for myself and really come from a place of compassion. And then sometimes it can help to get other perspectives if I'm feeling like really unclear about how that um, criticism, like where it was coming from, or like not understanding it. Sometimes there's an invitation to go back to the person who's offering it, but sometimes, especially if it's like a person of color, then maybe that's where I need to go to my white affinity group or like get support from other folks who have had a lot of experience in anti-racism. So it really kind of depends on the on the feedback. But yeah, more and more I've been, working to cultivate my own like, connection to my own inner knowing and how does this land? And usually there's something that's true there for me, and then usually there's something that's not mine, right?
Mhm.
So I
Right.
think part of it is also um, trying to reframe from an all or nothing, they're wrong, I'm right, um, or I'm all wrong. I did such a horrible job. So try to
So
nuance
where
it
do
a.
you think white women are the most receptive, with other white women talking to them or with global community?
Well, I think it depends.
You'd
um,
be a
I
great politician.
like I I don't know if you've had conversations about like racial identity development for white folks. But there's a couple of different frameworks, and happy to share some of those. But, often for white folks who maybe have not had a lot of deep, real relationships with folks of color or who are in primarily white environments, that maybe like another white person it might be easier for them to receive that information. Often it's not linear, in terms of understanding development, but often when white folks begin to like understand racism, that it exists, and really begin to make it a value, like racial justice a value, then there can be this way that white folks like rush to go into communities of color or kind of rush to like only listen to the people of color in their lives, right? Like there can be this kind of overcorrection, even like the tokenizing that can happen of folks of the global majority, or just like um, Yeah, and I think people who are in that space, sometimes it's more effective for the information to come from someone who's not white, right? Who can like, um, uh, yeah. So I think it can depend where white folks are in their racial development, identity, and development journey.
It's
But
like if you're
hopefully,
too close to your mother, you're not going to hear anything she says. But if a friend of yours says it, then it hits. Yeah.
right. Yeah, I just had an experience with an affinity group, which, usually the idea of affinity groups comes out of a multiracial, multicultural organizing model. And the idea is that like, okay, we're going to break into these groups, affinity groups based on how we've been racialized to do some really important work and have some really important conversations. And then we're going to come back together. And if folks have not been exposed to that model, especially for white folks who can be like, we're segregating, right? We all white people coming together to talk to only other white people is bad. So there can be like a lot of like anxiety and fear that comes up. And we had recently a group where some of the white folks in the group were like, we should be paying a person of color to facilitate this group, not another white person, right? And there are folks who do that professionally, but typically, that is work that other white folks need to be doing, both so that we can learn how to do it with each other and not outsource the labor to folks of color. And usually, folks of color, there's exceptions, but usually those people don't want to be holding the white affinity space, right? Because it can be re-traumatizing to have to experience to do that labor. And even though there are some people who do that and hopefully are very well compensated, like typically that's not something that most people are interested in. So yeah, I think that can be a place where, in this instance, the white person actually needed to hear from a person of color that like, no, 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 I want you all to do this work, and I don't want to leave the space. So in that instance, they needed someone else to come in and kind of speak from their perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I did work with Dr. Nikki Lanier, and she founded the Rare Woman Collective, Radical Action Advancing Racial Equity, and I made a 5-year commitment. I'm halfway through that commitment now, but she said in the beginning I was on TikTok and back in the day, and I was getting some blasts from some black creators about white women talking about this. I had somebody who was a author on the podcast who was afraid to publish her book because she was a white woman talking about antebellum, right? And didn't know how it would be received. And Dr. Nikki said, in no uncertain terms, you don't need to be talking to those people. You don't need to be paying attention to what they think about what you're doing. Your message is for other white women who have proximity to power, who can move this needle, because you can get into rooms, me as a white woman, professional, can get into rooms where she will never have access no matter how many degrees she has, because of the perception or the accessibility or the inequity. And it's a very hard thing sometimes to hold that line in my own white community of women who think um, who see it from a different lens. You
Yeah.
know?
I mean, I think like it can come from a place of scarcity, right? That is like, okay, we have limited resources. Where do we put them? And so I do think there is a history of white folks stealing, right? Like other people's call it cultural knowledge and experiences, and then packaging it and marketing it and making a lot more money off of it. So I think it's really important to like understand that history, and be really clear about relationships of accountability and how this is not just about personal profit. And so I think those considerations are all really important. And at the same time, like, yeah, exactly, exactly what you're saying. Like, it's if you look at all the books that white people have written over the course of time, like what would it be if all of those books had an anti-racist framework, right? We need more white folks writing from that perspective of anti-racism or doing their work from that place of anti-racism, not fewer. And also, we need to really uplift the work that folks of color have been doing for generations of naming their experience and educating, and all of the labor that especially Black and brown women, but communities of color have also been doing. So
Well,
I see
this
a
is a
possibility.
long-term game. This is not a short-term fix. I started this with reclaiming joy in DEI 2.5 years ago, and the whole model of what is racism. It was all just intellectual knowledge, go to the book, study, do the thing, until the question was asked and I actually had to consider, what has racism cost me? Because
Mhm,
until I recognize how it has impacted my life for good or for evil, and that it has cost me something that I never agreed to pay, and yet I'm living with the consequences, that brought a whole new energy and meaning and passion and sustainability to staying in this conversation, no matter what's happening on the outside.
yeah.
And it allowed me to bring grace to other people and their experience over the gotcha of having to fight to be right.
Mhm,
To say, until I saw the effects in my own life and the privilege my children had that I assumed all children had, and I
mhm,
was wrong,
mhm.
and the systemic underpinning.
Yeah,
You don't know what you don't know.
yeah. And that's so powerful too, because you're embodying the solidarity, right? You're in solidarity. It's not this thing that you are going to pick off the shelf and then put it back down. It's like, no, I'm harmed by this too. Like this is all connected. And, my children and other people's children are all impacted by, I mean, we all are impacted by this, right?
Sure,
Racism creates harm in so many ways, and in addition to the ways that it upholds other systems of harm. So yeah, that's a
and
really
it's
a really
baked
powerful
in.
thing.
It's
Hmm.
baked into the education, to the churches, to the family systems, and it's a system. It's not a person. It's not a preference. It's not an independent one off. It's the systems. How do you get people to actually do the work, which needs to be looked at individually, and then expand that to the systems and when they're doing work with others?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important too. I mean, I always encourage folks to be organizing in their own communities, like to be in relationship. And I really see the mistress syndrome work and the work that we do in the affinity spaces as complementary, right? It's not standalone. It's really about, okay, what is the work that we need to do so that we can show up better in our organizing in our communities in multiracial, multicultural spaces. Um, so yeah, I think always, it can be a lot then to be, making commitments in multiple spaces, but um, without having those experiences, it's really hard, I think, to connect deeply to some of the things that I'm unpacking in the book too, right? Like it really helps if you're someone who has maybe gone to a protest and felt uncomfortable, or showed up at a community meeting and like didn't know exactly, like was awkward, didn't know how to interact, or has had those call-in moments, right? Like that's really, I wrote this book because it was the book that I needed when I was at this stage of organizing. There's so many great resources, like more anti-racism 101 and like naming the systems. And so for me, it was like, okay, I've been in it. Like I get the systemic effect. And also I'm still having these um, big issues in the interpersonal dynamics, and like how I'm holding my own whiteness while trying to show up well in majority Black spaces.
Yeah.
um, my role as someone who was running a youth program, which was again a multiracial space, but predominantly had Black and brown youth. And I'm another white woman who's running a youth program. Like, what does it mean for me to be a gatekeeper in the institution and in the lives of those young people? And how do I not replicate the harm that I know they're experiencing in their lives? I don't want them to replicate it here. So yeah, it's like a both and with that as well.
So, how do you have any pointers for women, white women, to move in Black spaces.
Mm,
Any from our own experience of missteps, that you don't know your misstep until you've already done it, right?
yeah. I think it's really important to like reflect on the relationships in that those spaces. Maybe like how you came to be in those space. Like, was there an invitation? Like, how did you enter the space? Like, just to kind of be aware of that, or if you're considering going into space, kind of being aware of the if there's an invitation or not. What are your relationships? How are you continuing to cultivate those relationships in an authentic way? Um, and yeah, and just, I mean, especially if you're a white woman going into a majority Black space, I think it's important to, of course, like not center yourself, in that space. That one feels a little bit more obvious, but I think it's important to name, right? Um, and to, like, um, yeah, just like to find other spaces where there might be questions that come up for you or things that you want to unpack. Just that might not be the space to do it in, right? So just kind of be mindful when those things come up, and then also like somatically, how are you supporting yourself to show up well in that space? Like, how are you taking care of your body? How are you noticing what your nervous system is doing when you're in the space? How do you care for yourself um, afterwards? Um, yeah.
Do you do this affinity work digitally, virtually, or is it always live, and is it always in person? And what do you find is the difference?
I would love to only do it in person. No, most of it has been online. I, when I was in Pittsburgh, and this would have been, before COVID and before 2020, we were doing mostly in-person groups. And then went online, as many people did, which, opened up the possibility of doing this work more remote. So I would say the majority of groups and spaces I facilitate these days are online. But I still have been able to do either hybrid versions or a couple of groups that are place based where I'm at. And yeah, always the preference is to be in person.
Well, the
Uh,
energetic exchange is palpable,
yeah,
and I read the room well, but it's more difficult to do that. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult. And to hold people's attention
hmm
in a digital space, because they've got a screen over here and a screen here and this one, and children on the door, and it, it can be challenging to stay focused. How do you frame your online group so that people can be present?
Right now, I've mostly been doing book groups. So
Mhm.
we're going through chapter by chapter. There's a discussion guide that anyone can access, but we loosely follow that. Like, it's been so far, it's been a more facilitated space. Um, and those groups typically have been 2 hours every other week. And so we always start with a grounding, an invitation to be in the body, to do some breath work. We do pair shares or small groups. Usually those spaces are not more than like 14 or 15. So it's a more intimate group. Um, and use a circle process, as best as you can use a circle and a grid. Um, and invite folks to, bring something that helps to ground them, to share. One of the favorite things that we've done, one of my favorite, is to find something that smells good to you, like whether it's a candle or a spice from your kitchen or soap or a plant, and just to have that that people can introduce. It's a way of community building and getting to know folks, but then also then using that scent as like a place to come back to. So some of those sensory things, occasionally we'll do like writing prompts or art making as well. Yeah, but it takes time. It also takes time, just to build relationships when folks don't know each other, and then to do it virtually. It does time. And I'm asking folks, like, the invitation and the challenge is to like be vulnerable and go deep with some personal stuff. So I'm always really impressed with how people show up. And the folks who want it, right? The people who are there, who are hungry for it, will get out of it what they want and need. Um,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so for me, I prioritize safety in a container. So we have courtesies we agreed on, et cetera, et cetera. But I am the perpetual keeper of the flame as
mhm,
long as the room is open.
mhm,
When you have people who are disengaged, because they don't normally are likely to be adversarial online, they're more likely to just check out.
right, yeah.
How do you make that space safe for the ones who are going deep, or
Mhm.
do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it can depend. Usually these groups are pretty small, so that's usually a one-on-one follow-up that I would do with folks afterwards. Or I haven't been facilitating on my own. I have other co-facilitators. Um, Also, I like to use the breakout rooms really strategically. So if I'm noticing early on that someone's struggling with someone or checking out, then to make sure to pair them with someone who I know is like ready and can engage with that, or with one of the facilitators, like to do a check-in. Um, and I also we do community agreements and check in with those regularly. Um, but I would say mostly folks, um, like the people who are really opting out, just stop coming. That's usually my experience. Like, or will come really sporadically. Um, and that doesn't for me, that doesn't mean that they're not getting anything out of it. Like, I think there can still be learning that happens, or
Sure.
seeds that can be planted. Um, yeah, and just always inviting folks to, you know, reminding them of their own agency to share, and to the extent that they want to share. And even though the invitation is there, like, really, people are still, take care of yourself, share what you feel most comfortable, like those types of reminders, giving options.
How long have you been doing this work?
Um, well, I've been doing anti-racist organizing through like a more explicit anti-racist framework since 2013, 2014. But I also, even before that, I was brought, I I was raised in like a social justice Mennonite Anabaptist culture, and also like really nurtured in the legacy of the civil rights movement in Atlanta. So in that way, like racial justice and civil rights history was really integrated into my upbringing in different ways. So I would say that has been lifelong, but to really organize using an explicitly anti-racist frame, it's been more like 12 or 13 years.
Yeah. And what have you seen change over that time?
Well, there's a lot more, people are a lot more familiar with language around racism, systemic racism, anti-racism. There's a lot more comfort, especially with white folks, I think. And um, obviously with with 2020 and Black Lives Matter, I think there's been like swells of especially white folks who have been like, okay, like I need to be paying attention to this. um, so I think the kind of overall like zeitgeist language, there's definitely been a cultural shift, and just the amount of resources that are available now, like also because of social media and the way the internet is used. I mean, there's just like so much information, if that's what people are looking for. And then also, what has changed has been the pushback, right? Which means stuff is working. Like, we've
Yeah.
been effective.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's just been like um, really harsh, right? The severity of the pushback, which historically we can look at whenever movements are successful, then we see that. So that's been, that white supremacy, explicit white supremacy, is more and more in, also like in public spaces. And what was I was underground, and people on the right, especially, were organizing to bring it to this point. But there's definitely like even more and different, maybe different threats of violence based on that.
Well,
Mhm.
and with the intersectionality that you talked about in the beginning that you work with, it seems as though society, or the move, the backslide, has been to fraction it off and pick off the most vulnerable from among the vulnerable to
Mhm.
target, to make as the collective problem,
Yeah.
rather than how do you support those folks in your affinity work?
How do I support folks who are vulnerable
Yeah,
or
yeah, who are now experiencing, besides what they did as gender or class or race, now they've been picked out because they're a subset of a subset.
that are being more targeted right
Mhm.
now? Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, for me, it's really helpful. I always go to history, but like to understand that like this isn't new, like really the way that the US was constructed is based off of a lot of these things. It's certain communities have experienced fascism for the entire history of the United States. Um, so for me that is really grounding because it's even though myself or others might be experiencing it in a new way or for the first time, this has actually always been people's experience, and also people have always resisted it, right? There's also, along with that history, there's like so much wisdom and legacy of resistance and resilience and like um, you know, eh, yeah, so much to learn from, right? The communities that have survived and thrived under, fascism. So for me, that is really a place of finding strength and energy and strategy. Like there's so much information there. And so that's encouraging. There's a book, Rehearsals for Living, which is Leanne Betamasaki Simpson and Robin Maynard are writing. They're both in a more of a Canadian context. They're writing these letters to each other, and are talking about like world endings and climate crisis, and um, they are reminding each other that our people. Leanne comes from a Indigenous background, and Robin is Black Canadian. That our people have actually experienced world endings before. Um, and so yeah, it's like there's a lot of heaviness and tragedy in that, right? Acknowledgement in that history. And also there's just like, for me, there's like a faithfulness to, okay, what are we doing about it? And what is also, what are the whose shoulders are standing on, right? It's not
sure.
just,
And what have we learned? Yeah.
mhm.
I didn't, I wasn't much of a history buff before I started our podcast, but I've had some historians on, and it didn't take me very long to say women were always the thread of resistance.
Mm,
Whether it was in the Underground Railroad that came through White Vermont, whether it was in Vietnam between on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it was the overlooked and under appreciated women who were cleaning the huts, who were memorizing the maps, who were carrying the messages, and those networks, some of them were extremely well organized and very strategic in the fact that the woman in question who was carrying the information really didn't know who the order came from.
mm,
She knew
mhm.
the one person be ahead of her and the one person next to her, and that is all. So if they tortured her, she had no information to give, and that was by strategy. But all of that gets stored in our trauma centers and passed down through generational DNA. So when I look at my um, Heinz 57 background that I knew nothing about until a year ago because I had never done the genealogy, um, I can say that what I know is that mine may be centuries or generations, but I know that some of the people I'm interacting with are millennial. It
Mhm.
is, that knowing that what you know in your body that you don't know you know, but it's there in the moment you need it. That is my hope in this shit show.
Mhm. Yeah.
is that ancestral knowledge, that generational wisdom is going to show itself.
Mhm. Yeah. And it is showing itself. Like it's here, it's present with us. And I see it in the ways that, women and queer folks in particular do that connectivity work that you're talking about, like the relationships. That's like building the structures. And that's what is like, no matter what is happening on the systemic structural level, like that's something that's going to be there. I have this like image of tunneling, and I think about, okay, what are all of those interconnected tunnels that we can create no matter what? And the stuff that's on top, I mean, it's going to destroy itself, right? It's going to fall in. And then we will have this because we already have that, right? We have each other, we have those relationships and those connections and the cultural wisdom.
And
Yeah.
that is what has endured
Hmm.
and and gets the phoenix rising,
Hmm.
you know
Right. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
gets sparked again. So when people want to work with you, want to learn more about what you do, where do they find you?
Well, mistresssyndrome.com is my website, and it has information about my book and also how to contact me. I also have a Patreon account. Um, that's where folks who participate in the book groups sign up for the Patreon. And then I have a bunch of resources there. I also have a free newsletter that people can sign up for. I can share those links with you. And that comes out monthly is my commitment. Never more than monthly.
So are you a solopreneur or do you have a team who helps you?
Yeah, it's just me with Mistress Syndrome, and then I have a number of colleagues that, especially like to co-facilitate, that I reach out to and contract with.
Gotcha.
So people I partner with who also often have their own businesses or work in other spaces. So I have a number of people and businesses I collaborate with, but for the Mistress Syndrome work, it's just me. Hmm.
And so do you have any parting thoughts or any wit and wisdom to leave our
Mm,
viewers with?
yeah, I think acknowledging the paradoxes of this moment and this work is like, yeah, it's things are incredibly urgent, and also they've always been incredibly urgent. And like the inner work that my book and a lot of other resources are asking folks and inviting folks to do is slow. It's like, you can't push your body, we don't want to force ourselves to do it. So there's like also this paradox of urgency that we need to be ready and have already been ready. And also there's like the reality of how long it takes to deconstruct in the body and honor the trauma and the pain and the harm and like move with it. And that relationships too, like that can be really slow work. I'm in a relatively new place, and I'm having to like rebuild all of my foundational relationships. And I was like, let's go. I moved here at the end of 2024, but it's like, no, the work is only going to move at this can only move at the speed of trust. So
Hmm,
just like honoring those
beautiful.
those paradoxes that, yeah, it's slow and it can feel like sometimes like, why am I looking at myself when like all of these policies need to change immediately? But they're both very connected. So trying to hold those paradoxes, I think, is something that I'm continuing to work on and learn how to do. So.
I like that speed of trust conversation, because when trust is broken, it's very difficult. And when trust got broken before you were born, even know where to start. I learned a long time ago that trust can be rebuilt if you talk to people instead of about them, and
Mhm.
if you assume good intent, because those two things are kind of key. But none of us learned that in our dysfunctional families. We
Mm-hmm.
learn don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, and don't trust anybody outside of our family, our religion, our, you know, economic status. So it's there's unpacking no matter how you want to approach it. What I can what I believe wholeheartedly is this harm didn't happen in isolation, and you can't heal from it in isolation. It really takes community involvement, whatever that community looks like, and it helps to have facilitated, guided, constructive conversation, because without an adult in the room, those inner children can just run right off into the ditch.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the work that you do and the books that you write, and I'm excited to share it with our.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation and for the conversation and all your questions. It's lovely, lovely to be with you today.
Thank you, Amanda.